Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Willkommen zu unserem Themenspecial Medtech Update India. Mein Name ist Kirsten Herrmann und ich bin Deputy Director der Exportinitiative Gesundheitswirtschaft. Heute bei mir bzw. in Indien zugeschaltet ist Tarun Gupta. Er ist CEO und Managing Partner von T&A Consulting und berät dort seit über 18 Jahren Unternehmen im Markteinstieg in Indien und ist seit knapp einem Jahr Partner von der Exportinitiative und erstellt für uns dort die monatlichen kostenlosen Newsletter Medtech Update India und Pharma Update India, um Unternehmen der Branche dort über regulatorische Themen zu informieren. Heute wird er über den Medizintechnikmarkt in Indien sprechen, besondere Bedingungen dort, vor allem welche Medizinprodukte aktuell das höchste Exportpotenzial bieten, was zu beachten ist beim Import und welche Art der Zulassung und Zertifizierung erforderlich sind und welche Dokumente eingereicht werden müssen. Das alles erfahren Sie auch zu anderen Ländern von der Exportinitiative Gesundheitswirtschaft. Wir sind vom Bundeswirtschaftsministerium eingesetzt worden, um Unternehmen der Branche bei ihrem Exportgeschäft zu unterstützen. Das ist zum einen mit Marktinformationen zu Gesundheitsmärkten weltweit, aber auch natürlich bei der Vermarktung im Ausland und der Vernetzung mit ausländischen Partnern. Außerdem suchen wir den Dialog mit Entscheidungsträgern in wichtigen Märkten, um dort den Weg für sie zu bereiten. Das finden Sie alles kostenlos auf unserer Webseite www.exportinitiativegesundheitswirtschaft.de. Jetzt möchte ich aber tatsächlich übergeben an Herrn Gupta. Wir werden das Themenspecial auf Englisch durchführen. Deswegen wechsle ich jetzt auch. Hello and welcome, Tarun. Thank you for being available today. And I'm just switching the screen to you now. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting special today.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you for all our participants for taking time out and listening to this webinar. So over the next 20 to 25 minutes, I will try and give you a brief on the medtech sector in India. And so let me just spend the first few minutes to give you from the demand side. Thereafter, I will talk about the supply side, share about some dynamics, and finally move on to the regulatory framework. So let's step back and talk about the demand side. To give you a perspective, in India, the public's healthcare expenditure to GDP is amongst the lowest in the world at about 1.5%. We aim to take it up to 2.5% by 2025. We have very low medical healthcare insurance penetration. In fact, our retail medical healthcare penetration is at about 10%. And our out-of-pocket healthcare spend is amongst the highest in the world, nearing about 70%, which is 5 times if you look at it as a percentage spent for Germany. So what's the result of all this? The result, unfortunately, is that we have a large number of people falling back into poverty because of unanticipated healthcare spend. We have 200,000 deaths per month from treatable diseases. And this, if you look at it over the last 7 months, our diseases due to COVID have been less than 200,000. So it just gives you how many of these diseases can be prevented from quality healthcare. However, things are changing. Today, India has rolled out over the last 2 years the world's largest healthcare insurance scheme, under which 400 million people have been enrolled, under which they are eligible for up to 6,000 euros of healthcare insurance annually. And we have 24,000 hospitals empaneled, about 1,500 packages and fixed prices for various surgeries. $10 billion have been reimbursed. So one of the key messages I want to give is the role of private sector hospitals. You have corporate hospitals, tertiary hospitals, single specialty hospitals, all coming up in India. And these are the largest demand generator for medtech equipment. And I would also like to mention the role of private equity in funding these hospitals. And at the moment, majority of them are in big urban centers. Moving on to the supply side. In India, the domestic companies are smaller. They are focused on consumables and primarily on Me Too products. However, if you look at, we have large global players in India. And some of the important highlights is that this sector is dependent on imports. 75% of medical devices are imported. And look at the high growth rates. We are expecting growth rate of 16% till 2025 and really doubling of our medtech sector from $10 billion to $20 billion. Even now, our per capita healthcare spend is very low at about $5 compared to over $60 per capita medtech spend globally. And the other aspect is the growth in imports. Last year, we had a 24% year-on-year growth in imports. And finally, the emergence of Indian medtech startups. That's a new trend. And the reason for that is the Indian price sensitivity. So some important messages on this slide is high growth rate, 16%, doubling of medtech market in 5 years, the import dependency, and price sensitivity. Moving on to various segments. If you look at it, some of the imaging segment is dominated by large players from USA, Japan, and Germany. For in vitro diagnostics, we are talking about import dependency on reagents. Over 77% are imported. And another big trend is point of care testing. This is, even in the current COVID scenario, this has really picked up. And because of the emergence of telemedicine and also the fact that access to healthcare outside of large urban centers is still fairly limited. Moving on, I mentioned about the Indian supply side scenario. Nearly 80% of it is in the small scale sector, less than 2 to 3 million euro turnover. Majority of them cater to the consumable sector. In fact, in whole of India, if you see, there are only 15 firms with an annual turnover of over 25 million euros, which gives you an idea that how much scale is possible in India. Some of the domestic manufacturers are focused on syringes, needles, catheters, where in fact we are exporters to the parts of the globe which you see on this slide. One important aspect from an exporter I would like to talk about, from an overseas exporter, is the distribution channels in India. They remain fragmented. In fact, this is one of the big entry barriers for foreign companies, is the lack of national level distribution. And also most of the distributors lack in technical competence for after sales service. There is a big untapped demand on tier 2, tier 3 cities. And here I would like to mention a new trend is on e-pharmacies, which are also become an important distribution channel for point of care diagnostics devices. So 2 or 3 big messages from this slide is: A, distribution channel remains fragmented; B, emergence of new e-pharmacies as a channel to sell your point of care diagnostics. Moving on, if you look at some of the segments here, a key finding which comes out is that a lot of these imports into India are from OECD countries. And there is now a demand coming from, I mentioned earlier, in the private sector, but also private sector from the single specialty clinics or single specialty chains. These are specialist orthopedic hospitals for orthopedic implants. These are dental chains. I'll talk later in my presentations. Nephrology centers, diabetic centers. We have the world's largest diabetic or the second largest diabetic population. We suffer tremendously from arthritis, so a demand for orthopedic implants. So these are all the segments which are driving the demand for quality medtech products. Who are some of the foreign players? If I go back, as I mentioned, all the large players are present in India. These multinational players have set up operations. However, at the moment, their operations are mainly for importing, distributing, and providing support function. Very few multinationals have started domestic production. Some of them have started by acquiring domestic manufacturers. Government of India is giving a big thrust on local manufacturing and have identified clusters for medtech manufacturing in India. This is one slide which gives you an idea of some of the diagnostics items. Another key message on this is the implementation of goods and service tax, which happened a couple of 2-3 years ago in India. It has made the import of medical devices cheaper because you can get some of the benefits of this GST. You can claim input credit on that. So that has worked favor of medical devices. On this slide, it tells you some of the key exporters. And you look at the slide, compare the figures compared to Germany. In fact, they have shown tremendous growth in the last year. So Germany is amongst the top exporters of medtech into India. At the moment, more limited to larger German companies, but we do see opportunities for small to mid-sized German medtech companies in this fast-growing Indian market. Dental segment, underpenetrated. In fact, you look at our dentist to population ratio, 1 to 10,000 in urban and 1 to 250,000 in rural areas. So one of the key drivers is medical tourism. Dental tourism is a large share. Today, from a personal example, my brother, who's an American citizen, finds it cheaper to fly to India, get his medical treatment done, than going for a dental treatment in the United States. So yes, we have about 750,000 odd medical tourists every year, and the aim is to take it to 3 million medical tourists by 2030. And that is also driving the demand for quality medical infrastructure. And if you look at within dental, the second trend are the large dental chains which are being set up, large corporate groups which are setting up specialist dental chains. So as a result, if you are a provider of dental equipment, earlier you had to go to every dental chain individually, but now if you are successful, you can roll out your dental equipment across many dental clinics, which is a big advantage. And in this segment, whether it's implants, whether it's dental equipment, we are heavily import dependent. So 3 key messages on dental: underpenetrated, presence of large players who are scaling up, and medical tourism driving the demand. Moving on, Indian diagnostics. So if we look at the demand scenario, I spoke about private hospitals, large private hospitals. We spoke about single specialty hospitals. We spoke about dental chains driving the demand, and a big demand driver are the diagnostic chains, especially even in the current scenario, if you look at it. However, if the dynamics are changing in the Indian diagnostic sector, at the moment, it's highly fragmented. Standalone centers accounting for 45 to 50% and organized only accounting for 35%. But if you see on the slide now, we are seeing large diagnostic chains setting up hub and spoke structures, acquiring smaller independent players, expanding into tier 2, tier 3 cities, and they are backed by private equity investors. Second, so one is the large diagnostic chains backed by private equity. Point of care diagnostics, I already spoke about. Third is even the regulatory environment now is supporting consolidation. Earlier, we did not have any minimum standards. Anybody could set up a diagnostic center. Now we are looking to set up minimum standards in terms of infrastructure, manpower, equipment, and also accreditation. Currently, only 1% of our pathology labs are accredited. So we are now have our accreditation board for testing and laboratories, which will expect to drive demand for this. This message is on the diagnostic segment, is venturing into more sophisticated high-end testing. That's something, whether it's related to oncology, we have about 1 million cancer patients every year, whether it's generation sequencing, and some of the major imports in this category are related to computer tomography, scanning apparatus. So diagnostic equipment is one of the largest component in medical device imports. This is something which gives you a market size of some of these broader segments. I mentioned that we expect the medtech whole segment to double by 2025, growing at about 16%, growing to about $20 billion. So you look at some of these segments within that, and we've gone deeper. Even within that, if you see this slide, talks about, for example, if you talk about diagnostic imaging, what are electrodiagnostic demand? This is just to give you an overall, how does the pie look like in 2025? What we have done is, we have also now gone in further deep to mention which segments are attractive for you as a German exporter. So for example, dental products, we have rated it very high. You look at the import dependency, we have rated in vitro diagnostics, again, very high. Lab reagents, again, you look at the import dependency. Orthopedics, very high because of mention the large demand in India, again, import dependency. So hopefully this gives you a perspective on what are the higher potential product segment within the overall medtech space. So with that, I come to the second part of my presentation, which relates to the regulatory. We've spoken about demand, supply, market opportunity. Now I will focus more on the regulatory. Historically, this sector was largely unregulated. There were only few types of medical devices which the Indian government regulated. There was no specific government oversight on manufacture import, no approval required. Only 16 medical device categories were really regulated. Strangely, it was under Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So you had some strange requirements to have a quarantine room if you were manufacturing a device, maximum expiry of 5 years, even if your product could go. So yeah, it was largely unregulated, and there were challenges as well, continue to have challenges, which is government controls the price of certain devices. So, and then for certain devices, you cannot increase the price. There are multiple regulators, and also there are restrictions on promoting of medical devices if you are trying to promote it as a cure for certain conditions. So this was broadly the scenario. Things changed. In 2018, 1st of January, we had the new medical devices rule. We brought about the concept of risk-based regulation. So as a result, now we are bringing 13 more medical devices into regulation. So what we have done is, now we classify devices based on risk from class A to class D. So depending on the risk, you need approval from the state authorities or from the federal authority. We have a residual shelf life based on these classification. However, it's important to note that the classification is decided by the government specification. As an exporter, you cannot decide, and you do not have the right to appeal. So basically, the norms will decide where your product will fall under. Then we have regulations now pertaining to labeling. So the name of the manufacturer, manufacturing facility, name of the importer, all those details need to be put on the label. We have an accreditation body. We have a notified body for doing audit. So really, with this, from 2018, we have this medical devices rule, which are in line with the international norms and are more risk-based. But if you notice, even these, really, out of the 1700, even the medical devices rule, out of the 1700 really, cover only 29 devices. So what government did from earlier this year, they brought about really all a notification wherein all the devices came into medical regulation rule. Earlier it was 29 odd devices. Now everything else, with the exception of a category called new devices. I won't go into so much detail, but broadly a sense of this is, you need an import license for all categories of devices. You need an import license and registration certificate if your device falls under notified category, and if you can register your device, certain devices on a portal, you get more time or more exemption to get that import license. So if you're a German exporter, you need to understand in what 3 categories your product will fall under. Notified, you need both registration and import license. If you fall under medical device rules, you need an import license only. However, if you can get an exemption, then you get more time to get that import license. Now, what foreign manufacturers often do, they do not have an Indian subsidiary. So who gets that import license? Typically, they appoint a third-party importer authorized agent to apply for this import license. We've listed the document process. There has to be given a power of attorney. One important advantage of an exporter from Australia, Canada, Japan, EU, Germany is that it helps in the import license. When you attach the free sales certificate from the National Regulatory Authority. That really, and now there is a set timeline also to get this import license, although it's 9 months, hopefully it comes down. And if the approval is not given within that category, it is deemed to be given. So government is trying to rationalize this. Another concern, this is just kind of a list which is there. I won't go into details. I've already covered it. Another concern has historically been in terms of patent protection, patent enforcement in India. Cover that. Now the government has introduced a reversal of burden of proof so that the defendant now has to show that they arrived at an identical product using a different patented process. Then the court now has the power to seize and destruct of goods which have created an infringement. Trademarks are protected under statutory and common law. So yes, Government of India is now cognizant of the value and importance of patent enforcement. A lot of steps are being undertaken. This is something, a recent cess was import on medical equipment, but we do not foresee a big challenge for this. Reason being on critical devices, we continue to be dependent on imports. Moving on, I think I mentioned in terms of the whole classifying as drugs. Now the main authority is CDSCO. This is the main authority, and what we foresee is that all this will bring about more uniform and more quality awareness. So the importance of these regulatory changes is that fly-by-night operators and some of the so-called cheap imports may be impacted because the quality bar has to be raised, and that's the key message here. These are some operational changes, like in the current COVID scenario, because you could submit now online. You do not need to necessarily go through a notarized forms. You can submit that notarized later. So government is realizing that medical devices are essential, and we need to, while promoting domestic manufacturing, we need to make sure that the supply is not adversely impacted. So hence, and the final slide, which I move on, is on I mentioned earlier, the big challenge in India is that in certain device category, the prices are monitored and controlled, and price increases are controlled. So at the moment, it is restricted to certain devices, and we mentioned those devices. For example, 4 medical devices: cardiac stents, drug-eluting stents, intrauterine devices. So these are already under price controls, and government is in discussions with stakeholders to see what are the other categories of devices which may bring under price control. So yes, that's an element of risk as an exporter. However, I must add that this is also between bilateral treaties between Europe and India and US and India. This is a point of contention. With that, I come to the end of my presentation, and I summarize by saying that there is increasing healthcare spend, increasing insurance penetration, the role of private sector, the role of private equity in creating the demand, and the new regulation which is promoting accreditation and higher quality of devices with a more streamlined flow. Thank you so much for your patience. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Tarun. Und herzlichen Dank auch Ihnen, dass Sie heute wieder dabei waren. Sie finden alle Themenspecials unserer Serie auf unserer Website, ebenso natürlich wie unser komplettes Angebot www.exportinitiative gesundheitswirtschaft.de. Und wenn Sie nach Indien suchen, aber auch nach anderen Ländern, bitte schauen Sie auch bei GTI vorbei, www.gti.de/Indien, beziehungsweise können Sie das auch mit weiteren Märkten durchexerzieren. Vielen Dank und auf Wiedersehen.